it's all right with the panel, I'm going to throw it open to questions from the audience. And excellent. We've got enthusiasm here. So where's that roving mic? Great. I'm going to start with the lady way at the back, because I have a fear that the people on those sides of the pillar are not getting their fair share of questions. So I'm going to come back to everyone over here later, but woman in blue at the back.
Hi, my name's Katie Doherty and I work for the International Meat Trade Association. How would your proposals on veterinary checks work, particularly for SMEs using groupage, particularly those transporting short shelf life goods?
Excellent, specific question from Katie. Would anyone on the panel care to answer that?
Well, I'm happy to have a stab. I think the one of the key things, whether you're talking about cross-channel trade or whether you're talking about cross-border trade in the island of Ireland, when you're looking at the ways that patterns of trade might have to change a bit, it makes sense in order to get more efficiency into the system to try to group shipments, as you're alluding to, as much as possible. And so making sure that logistics service providers can be authorized as consignees within the transit system, I think is a very important part of that. That's the thing I've been pushing HMRC to do, and I think there's more that they could do on that front to make sure that those logistics service providers can aggregate those loads before they travel. You're absolutely right to point out that when you've got short shelf life goods, that has to be a really efficient process, and the operators on either side need to have time in an ideal world to refashion their operation so that they're set up to be operating such a system. Typically within the meat trade, if you're shipping a container of meat, that will tend to have a much, much higher value than almost anything else that gets shipped. So in terms of the cost per unit of customs transaction, as it were, there is potential for cost really to be driven out of that system as a price per unit cost. So I think we need to look at that in a creative manner and see what government can do if it needs to help to subsidize such types of operation or the adaptation towards that or encourage that in some way. Then that's a thing that we as a government should be able to make sure happens.
Do either of you want to come back on that before I go back to the floor?
I'm just wondering why there is a charge. Why can't the government just waive the charge for customs declarations?
Well, look, it's yeah. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the ins and outs of whether that would be possible under the terms of the WTO and the subsidy, and whether you could get an exception under the frontier traffic. You might be able to do that in that scenario. There are things that you might be able to do, but whether it's a subsidy to a type of industry that is doing this rather than an absolute waiver, I think that is probably a more sensible way of doing it, potentially. I don't know.
Yeah. I would only say, obviously there's a panel on technology later on, I think, or an operationalising panel, which will look at things like track and trace and these sorts of things that one can do. These would be my medium or slightly more than medium term things that can be worked out. But I think the question sort of highlights the issue of why it is so important to do a really deep investigation of the ability to have these common areas in place, because it does solve a lot of problems. It does take advantage of the fact that we are dealing with two islands and uses the natural choke points in the harbours and ports to do a lot of this kind of checking. So I think that is an important sort of element of it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on that side of the room? Anyone that's sitting near Katie? No? Everyone's good? Okay. Back, Willie?
Thanks very much. William Bain from the British Retail Consortium. The Republic of Ireland is going to continue to be a member state of the European Union. EU law will continue to apply in the Republic of Ireland. So can the panel explain what role the European Court of Justice will have in relation to the single UK and Ireland SPS area?
Wow, what a question. Robert, do you know?
Well, I'll have a stab.
Okay.
Well, you go first.
No,
No,
you go
you go first.
first.
I'll correct you.
I called.
I want to go as well.
I'm not letting Robert out of that. What do you think?
I think actually I do quite a lot of litigation in the court, and I think you'd have to have some kind of issue arising in the south of Ireland in order to have standing to bring a case, either directly or indirectly, to the European Court. I think if you take one of the other special zones, I think you'd be outside the area of the European acquis, and therefore it would be very difficult to bring a case for incompatibility with EU law.
I think you'd have two potential choices here. One, of course, if you were to have a common SPS area for the island of Ireland, clearly that would be under European law. It would be subject to the European Court of Justice in terms of the interpretation of the SPS regulations. In a common area, if you look at the Australia and New Zealand common food safety area, there is a separate regulatory system and a separate regulatory authority. Now, matters of European law in respect of how SPS issues are understood and interpreted would be a matter for the European Court of Justice. That doesn't mean that the whole area is fully within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So I think there are ways of being able to do both of these things. But it's clear that any interpretation of European SPS rules will always be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
Okay, the gentleman at the back by the cameras, please.
Two questions, one technical, one political. Just on the derogation for the
Sorry,
BEPS.
can you remind us
Oh, it's
who you
John
are?
Campbell from the BBC.
Brilliant, go ahead,
On
John.
the derogation for the BEPS, which said they don't have to be at the immediate point of entry. To be clear, that's to do with geographic constraints. So the Channel Tunnel, there's an issue. They don't have the space to build the BEPS around the trains. It might be harder to make that issue, say, for the main Belfast to Dublin road. There's loads of space. There's loads of slip roads. Would that derogation apply? And then just secondly, on the political point, I'm still struggling with the idea that it's more difficult politically to negotiate the all-island SPS zone as opposed to this brand new UK, Ireland, novel SPS arrangement.
Yeah. Well, listen, if I can come back on that, I mean, you're right to question it. It's not really for us to answer that. That ultimately, no, because ultimately that's an answer for politicians to look at the recommendations.
Well, I think the issue is, first of all, to the technical part of your question, yes, you're relying on the current geographic flexibilities of the BIP regulation. And we're going to have to be creative here. We're going to have to use the flexibilities creatively to find a solution that actually works. Now, it is important to understand that the overall direction of travel, if you go back in time, everything was done at a border inspection post, right? Everything, all trade. You know, you just had your customs officer ladling out the whiskey, etc. We are moving. There's a direction of travel here, and even in the SPS area, which is the last area for this to apply, we are moving away from border inspection posts as the way of doing these kinds of things. So I think you've got the BIP regulation flexibility. Yes, it's going to be an issue. All of this is going to be an issue in terms of negotiating it with the EU. In terms of the politics of the broader sort of area, what we're saying is, look, there are several things that one can do to solve this problem. What is the problem? The problem is you've got a unique situation with SPS goods, and you've got obviously unique not only in the fact that you've got supply chains around the island of Ireland, but also because they don't last very long, they're perishable, etc. So how do you solve this problem? And as I said, I think there's only four ways of doing it. So if there are 4 ways of doing it, you've got to figure out how can you make that real. What I would say, there are 2 things going for the broader area. One is it defers the decision about when you might lock into whose regulatory system to the point at which it becomes relevant, which is, I think, politically a very important element of this. And the second thing it does is that technology is not static. It's not whatever we have today is what we'll have for the rest of time. It is a lot easier to put the checks and controls that one needs in order to make trade work in the harbours and in the ports. And this does at least take advantage of the fact that we are dealing with two islands. So I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I mean, none of us in this report have said any of this is easy. But what we have said is there are only 4 things that you can really do here to solve this problem. Given the nature of the problem, and I think the question on meat trade was very important, given the nature of the problem, we really, really need to investigate whether these 4 things that we're suggesting can actually work, and we want to sort of start the conversation on that point.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take another question. Maybe John. John hasn't had a question.
John Mills.
There's a mic coming, John.
A theme running through much of what we've heard today is that given a reasonable amount of time, a transition arrangement, these problems that we're talking about look pretty soluble. What do you think is going to happen if the outcome of this autumn is that we just leave at the end of October? How much of a problem is it going to be if everything has to be compressed into a very short period of time?
Well, it goes back to the question that John Campbell raised earlier, in fact, which is if we leave with no deal, I mean, let's be very clear about what's going to happen. You are either, the EU cannot have an unexposed flank to its single market and customs union, and therefore that means that there either has to be a border on the island of Ireland, which we know is not going to happen, or there will have to be a border between the Republic of Ireland and the EU 26, which is both outcomes are not acceptable. So given the fact that both outcomes are not acceptable, I think it is legitimate, and our work is very much based on putting a set of ideas out for politicians and governments to take to actors and policymakers in the European Union, in member states, although in Ireland, to say, look, neither of these outcomes is acceptable. We need to come up with a solution. And I think what we have to do is we can't predict the future. We don't know where we're going to be on October the 29th or the 30th or just before the next relevant date. Let's put this on the table. Let's start the conversation. Let's everyone understand the constraints that everyone else is operating with. I think that's the most important thing, which hasn't been understood so far. And then let's also understand what happens in a no-deal environment. Let's understand the reality of that. And then I suspect that we will be able to move forward.
Okay, I'm going to take another question if that's all right. Should we go to Peter?
Yep. Just for clarification, you referred to we will need derogations for designated roads, for exempting small traders and so on. We, the United Kingdom, will not need derogations. We will just do that. So we're talking about the EU giving itself derogations in order to make the border invisible. Now, the EU has a perfectly legitimate right, as you've just mentioned, to protect the integrity of its own single market, to exclude goods it doesn't want to let in or apply tariffs to those that it does want to let in and so on. But it's it that will have to find the procedures to do that, hopefully in discussion with us, that will enable that to happen flexibly. What we've got to ask is it showing any willingness, just to take the issue of border inspection posts. As I understand it at present, if I want to move animals or meat, from Northern Ireland to Ireland, at present, I have to get a vet certificate, I have to register with Traces, I have to notify the other side, or Traces notifies the other side where it's going, and when it reaches either the abattoir or the new owner of the animals, that has to be taken on board. All that could be perfectly well mirrored without border inspection posts when we leave. It's the EU that says we will change that in one respect when we leave. We'll make all the goods go through a border inspection post, which must arguably be somewhere near the border. Could it give itself derogations there without creating problems in other borders the EU has with Belarus or
Okay, let's
so on?
give the panel a chance to respond to that then.
Yeah,
You want to have first go?
I'd like to first go. I think it's important to understand that in that situation, then it would make eminent sense to be looking at these sorts of simplifications and flexibilities in order to manage it. So I think it would be absurd in such a context for them to want to charge tariffs and us to want to charge tariffs on their goods. So I think it makes eminent sense to look at having a standstill arrangement. Clearly our regulations would at that point still be the same, and it would be entirely in our gift to maintain that position for a while in order to ensure that there wasn't a divergence reason for the EU to have to feel that its single market was under threat, to just give us a bit of breathing space. That, I think, would be the perfectly sensible conversation that would be had in such a circumstance. And of course we will talk about money, and of course we will talk about citizens' rights, and of course we will do these other things. We want to be friends with our neighbours, and so I don't think that necessarily has to be a difficult conversation, but it is a matter of political will first and foremost. But I think even the common travel area, the common SPS area, that would in the initial phase need some sort of a concept of deemed equivalence on regulation anyway to really operate in a sensible fashion.
Thank you, Marcus. Did either of you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I just the sort of context of our work is not just to determine, we're not the UK government, so our work is not to determine what works for the UK. Our work is to determine what is a solution. And in order to understand what is a solution, we need to understand the EU's dimension here and what they need to do, and put proposals on the table that work not only for the EU's single market customs union, but also for Ireland, and also for the UK. So yes, traces, people are putting their goods on traces anyway. That's certainly happening, and that will continue to happen. That happens for any agricultural SPS good in any event. But I do also think that as we started this work, we wanted to try to figure out what would be the solutions that would work for Ireland as well as the UK. Partly motivated, I will have to say, by the lack of solutions that were coming out of various places, and hope to kickstart that conversation. I mean, I do think that the conversation in Ireland has very much been, it's either the backstop. If it's the backstop or alternative arrangements, we'll go for the backstop. So therefore, we're not going to discuss alternative arrangements. And I think that's not a very realistic way of proceeding, and that doesn't recognise the constraints that we were talking about earlier. I want to say one very quick thing about trusted trader. I know we're having a panel on large traders, but there is an element of this that's relevant to SBS, which is, and it goes back to Jennifer's question about dairy. I mean, for a lot of the big trade in dairy, the Glanbia, the larger company Lactalis and so forth, those sorts of players, with very trusted supply chains that are constantly going back and forth across the border, that lends itself to some of these trusted trader programs. And if you can take as many traders as you can off that problem, take away that problem for them, then you can make the problem slightly more manageable. And that obviously applies also to Guinness and Diageo in their products, going back and forth.
Okay, I'm going to get more questions if we have any. Should we have a freight-related question? Excellent.
Given that much of what leaves Ireland in terms of freight either has legs or did have legs, and the lack of border inspection posts on the UK side of things, how in your work that you've done so far on a future solution, have you had an analysis on a no-deal situation? Would that freight still exist tomorrow if we was going to Brexit tonight, for example?
Anyone like to take that? Shanka?
Well, I mean, you're talking about so there's a significant amount of trade that it goes obviously from Ireland into GB. There's a lot of that trade that uses the land bridge to get into the European continent. A lot of that is agricultural. A lot of that is meat and other things. So we have crafted proposals for what we think would be a solution to the problem and a deal with the EU. In the case of no deal with the EU, then I think a lot of these, I mean, the government's response to that is simply to let it all, more or less, to let it all through. I don't think that's a very viable solution for more than a most temporary period.
It's one thing the UK government's having an opinion on that and letting everything through, but you won't actually be able to either leave the EU or enter the EU. So it's only hard.
And also the issue becomes, and this again comes back to this broader common area for SBS, is that you are going to have checks in Calais anyway. So if there is a significant amount of product that is moving from Ireland to the EU via the land bridge, it's going through the Dover-Calais channel, it's going to be checked in Calais. So there are going to be checks. So, so therefore, it does mitigate the concern that you're suddenly putting barriers between Ireland and the EU 26, because there will be checks in Calais for that level of trade.
Briefly, you want to come in, Marcus?
Yes, unless it's going under transit,
Unless it's on the transit,
in order
yes.
to go all the way through into
Right.
the EU on the other side, then there is going to have to be a process, because our successor to the traces system for the UK and our successor to the RASFF system for the UK in terms of food safety, those are two systems into which those products are going to have to be entered in order for the integrity of our own market and our assurance as a nation to others about what our supply chain is. That there is going to have to be a process around that, but we aren't going to be part of the EU acquis anymore, so we can choose to organise our border inspection procedure in a different way should we want to.
Sure, okay. I'm going to take, if there's any last questions, I'd like to get everyone involved. So Sam has a question. Does anybody else have a question? I appreciate I'm standing between you and lunch, but anyone and everyone, welcome. Okay, have a think. We'll hear from Sam.
Thank you very much. My question is on SBS, and I actually think there is an option you've missed out. And it's to do with, and this runs through the report a lot, this priority of having a fully independent free trade policy, a fully independent trade policy. If you strip that out, you would actually have much more flexibility. And it feels to me that actually that has been prioritised slightly over some of the other concerns. And the question specifically is, if you took out the desire to have a trade agreement with the US, which I think is the only one where this becomes a big issue, couldn't you just have a whole UK SPS region within the EU system, as Switzerland does and as Norway does? And that would solve the DUP issue, it would solve the UK issue, and it would solve the border issue in respect of trade across that border, and it would solve the issue with British exporters of animal origins going via Calais. So is this one of the areas where maybe you as a commission need to compromise?
Well, we'll get Shanka to intervene. I think what's interesting about our remit as a commission and as a technical panel was very much that the solutions had to fulfill all of the criteria. So it was, how do you protect the Good Friday Agreement? How do you ensure there's no physical infrastructure and checks on the border? How do you ensure it protects the single market? And how do you ensure that, in line with the wishes of the UK Parliament, that the UK maintains a trade policy? One may not like any fully independent trade and regulatory policy.
You still do a lot. You just made it very difficult with the US in this.
Shanka, do you want to come in?
I don't think it's just the US. I think many of the trading partners would want to see some sort of SPS flexibility. That doesn't mean we have to do it. That's a choice that we make, and a lot of these things are choices that politicians can make later on. Yeah. We do actually in the report talk about, if we were an EA member or if we had this sort of common area. But the reality is this will have an impact on that constraint. I think the solution to this in terms of negotiation is not to say we're going to minimise somebody's constraint before we even start. Yeah. I think the solution to this is to say, what are the constraints that everybody faces? Let's all at least agree that, and then we'll have a discussion. Now, we may get to the point, and this is why, again, I think deferring the decision to when the UK actually does diverge in the SPS area is the better way to handle it. We may get to the point down the road where we say, you know what, it doesn't justify, this problem doesn't justify that particular desire of the UK to have this agreement with this country or that agreement with another country. But I don't think the right way, just as it would not be right for us in the UK to say we're going to minimise the constraint on the Good Friday Agreement or not having physical infrastructure on the border, that would not be the right approach either. I think that's the way we start the discussion, and then let's see how that develops.
So independent trade policy at the same level as Good Friday Agreement in this discussion?
I think for the UK, because there will be disruptions of Brexit, it's clearly important for the UK to maintain the only benefits of Brexit are in an independent trade and regulatory policy, the only economic benefits of this. So you have to retain those in order to then overcome the disruptions. That's just a hard reality of Brexit. Now, if you choose later on that that's the constraint you have, but you're willing to sacrifice it in some way down the road, that's a choice that people can legitimately make. But I don't think that's a choice we make now.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions before we close? Otherwise, I will ring the lunch bell. Going once, going twice. All right. When are we coming back? Can someone tell me when everyone's due back in the 1:30? Okay, back in here for 1:30. Thank you very much.